think about all this stuff. And so one of my favorite words and concepts is the idea of a spectrum, the idea that things can sort of shift between one end and another. And there's actually, I have a very, very long list of, I prefer the word spectrums to spectra, even though I think spectra is probably technically correct. Spectra sounds a little too scientific, but anyway, there's a very long list. There's more, and as I'm looking at this, I'm like, oh, I forgot a couple of them. But I think the idea that you can kind of operate in between things that might seem to be binaries is really exciting to me, and that you can also sort of put things together that aren't meant to be together or don't kind of naturally go together, and try to find links between them. That's kind of where I operate. And so things I'm going to talk about during this talk, I will talk about quantum physics because I'm into it, but I'm also into everyday experience and sort of what we can see with our own eyes. And a lot of the work that I've made is kind of trying to reconcile the space in between those two things. What's unobservable, what we can see, what's information, what is abstraction, what's digital, physical, etc. So you can sort of see the list here. And I will touch on these things as I talk. So the first slide that I'm going to show you, and I'm not going to talk about my old work, but just to kind of give you a moment of where I kind of started. And actually, my interest in science started before this, I think. But yeah, when I was in grad school at VCU, I got really into different types of science things, including mostly including scientific architecture, but that's another story. In 2011, I was in New York and doing a residency at the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, and I got into laser etching. And I was working with these found graphs, and I was going on the internet searching for specific terms, whether it was gravity or spectrography or whatever, and pulling different graphs, saving them, and then making these Photoshop compositions out of them. And the reason I was doing that is because on a really fundamental level, something that interests me maybe more than anything else is the idea that one person can look at a scientific graph like this and see something very technical and very informative or full of data. And another person can look at it and see nothing informative whatsoever and only see kind of forms and abstraction. And that kind of paradox or that kind of contradiction is completely fascinating to me and has kind of guided me along my entire art practice as it moved into photography, which I will get to in a second. And I had been making work with found graphs for a long time, for a couple of years. And I was getting to a point where I started to feel like this is doing a lot of the things that I want to do, but the one thing it's not doing is allowing me to work with my own observations. I'm working with other people's observations, the data that other people have collected. And that's interesting because it's kind of allowing me to explore this idea of information and abstraction, but it's not kind of coming from me in a way that I wanted it to. And so I started to think about like, what else can I do if I was going to bring imagery back into this? What would happen? And how can I find something that is almost as otherworldly as these graphs are? And so then this crazy thing happened, which was that in 2012, I had the opportunity to go to Svalbard, which you can see here is an archipelago halfway between the north of Norway and the North Pole. And this was a residency, which I think still operates, except it's probably on hold right now, like everything else. Run by an organization between New York and Canada. And technically it was, it's a boat trip. It's for artists and scientists, although my trip was mostly artists. And it was pretty life-changing, as you might imagine. And this is me in 2012, completely dumbstruck. This is one of my favorite pictures of me ever. And my roommate on the boat trip took this photo, and I'm eternally grateful to her for it. But you can see in the background this schooner, which is, we were sailing around Svalbard on this schooner, which is just like kind of ridiculous in retrospect. But what was so interesting about this trip was that aside from being totally mind-blowing, it completely blew open my mind in terms of how I thought about a lot of things. And I had gotten there thinking about this concept from quantum physics that I had been obsessed with for a year or two, that empty space is not actually empty, that it's actually really dense, active, turbulent, and constantly sort of moving. And, you know, therein is my first paradox. Empty space is not empty, it's dense. That's a contradiction. That was something very interesting to me. And I was trying to think about, like, how can you make sense of something like that on these tiny, tiny scales when you can't see it? Like, how are we supposed to understand something that we can't see? And I had this question in the back of my mind, and I got to Svalbard, and this weird thing happened, which was that I realized in a very completely different way, this landscape itself was a kind of dense emptiness. And, you know, it was empty because we barely saw any wildlife. There was very little that was moving, like the water was moving, sometimes ice was moving. We did see a polar bear from afar. We saw birds occasionally, we saw a fox. You know, we did see things moving, but things were very still there. But there was this kind of superchargedness to the whole place that that really struck me, that it just felt like there was like a latent power in everything, especially the ice, but also in the mountains and just how big everything was. And there was, and so I just, the whole time I was there, I kept thinking, like, this is weird. This place, like, is this quantum physics space, but it's real. And it kind of allowed me to develop a kind of tool for my thinking, which was that, you know, maybe I can search for a way to understand all these things I cannot understand or I cannot observe by seeing stuff that I can, by looking at the world. And another really other fundamental thing happened there, which was kind of not, it's not a new idea. I was standing on the shoreline somewhere next to a woman who was one of our polar bear guards, because we did have polar bear guards, because there were polar bears. And anyway, she had been trained as a geologist. She was from Sweden, I think. And I just remember standing on the shore next to her and thinking, because she's trained as a geologist, she's probably seeing this whole landscape very differently than I am. And I'm looking at it in one way, and that's coming from my own experience, and she's looking at it in another way, and that's coming from her own knowledge and experience. And that, I think, is kind of a common philosophical idea, but it's one of those things where you don't fully understand it until you've had your own kind of embodied experience of that moment, of just like, I see something differently than this person does, even though we're looking at the same thing. And I think that kind of idea that what I see gets translated through me immediately as soon as it enters into my eyes and all my senses, became something that has now really become central to what I do. So I came back, and it took me quite a while to figure out what to do with the material that I had gathered there. I had gone with the intention of recording sound and video mostly, but I was also taking a lot of pictures because I had to, because it was the Arctic. But I came back and was like, it's a shame that I don't use photography because I have all these images, and what could I do with them? And so I started playing around, and I was actually working on trying to make some videos using video I had recorded there, and was making these images in the process of getting to that video. I was using, I was cutting out shapes in Photoshop basically to use as different elements to move around using After Effects. And, at some point someone came to my studio and I was showing him these, and we just started talking, and it was like, oh wait, maybe these are actually things in and of themselves, and kind of started to brainstorm how to print them, and materially how to turn them into these objects that really look like screens. And here's a close-up of one of them. And this was interesting. I mean, these pieces really mystify me still, honestly. Like, I have one of them in my bedroom right now, which is the first time I've ever put one of my own pieces in my bedroom. And it's so old now that it felt like it was okay to do that. And I look at it sometimes and I'm just like, I don't totally understand this, which is kind of nice. And it's nice that there's a thing that I made that I don't totally understand. And these were really the beginning of something that you'll see has kind of continued over a long time. And for people who are interested, I did an interview in Bomb magazine back in 2014 or 15 with Lucas Blaylock, photographer who you may have heard of. And we talk about this work and like the relationship between quantum physics and the Arctic and digital space. And it's a pretty good conversation. Lucas had a lot of interesting points. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, I can post the link to that later. I'll just play this while I talk. And so, you might have noticed that for all of those pieces, there was kind of this blank digital background with these objects floating in the space. And so a lot of the work from these couple of years was me trying to kind of articulate this concept of emptiness and density visually. And, obviously emptiness and density I had come to from a scientific terminology. But of course, then I realized these are also formal terms. They're also like visual terms. And the fact that quantum physics is abstract and my work is abstract and emptiness and density can be abstract, like this is enough material basically probably for me to operate and explore for my entire life as an artist. And so I was going back and forth between emptiness and density, empty space, digital space, and sort of dense digital space. And so this video was one of two pieces I made that I was thinking about more as moving drawings rather than a video. And so this is meant to live on a monitor rather than as a projection. And it's 14 minutes long. A lot of people who saw it in the first couple shows it was showed in were like, is this thing even moving? And I was like, how can you miss that it's moving? Of course it's moving. But there's like 100 some layers in here. Everything is moving very slowly. And over the course of 14 minutes, of course, it completely changes. And I was trying to kind of do the opposite of what those previous pieces were doing, where you could sort of operate, or you really had to experience that flat digital background that was simultaneously very deep. Here, I wanted to create like a really deep space where you never saw the background, basically. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and talk quickly about this project, which I did a year or two later. And this was a video, text, and sound performance screening event that I did many times in many different places. And so it had three parts. It had this, which was a silent video. It had a text that was projected, and then it had a sound piece that was played while an empty blue screen was projected. And so for all of the digital people in the room, you know that this is pure digital blue, 00255. And I was really kind of obsessed with this color for a couple of years as kind of this perfect digital emptiness. And I wanted to explore objects and sort of how matter might operate in this empty space. And so for this particular video, I took a bunch of stuff from NASA's website, basically, and then looped them into video. There's like a feedback thing going on here. Whoops, sorry, just lost it. Well, anyway, that's fine. So, oops. Oh no, now I'm getting lost. There we go. Sorry, let's see, jump ahead a little bit. So I was using solar flares. This is footage of volcanic lava erupting. These are scans of rocks that I made during a residency in Iceland that I sort of turned into this animation. There's water from Svalbard, more solar flares. So there's a bunch of stuff, but the idea behind all of this was, this is like matter existing in space, you know, so what is the relationship between this stuff and the space that it's in? And also, you know, kind of formally speaking, is this matter in space? Is this shape in the space, or is it kind of cut out from the space? So is it positive or is it negative? It's both. And the perfect square kind of being this very geometric kind of scientific form imposed upon these very natural kind of matter, matter material. And so this was one instance of the performance screening. I never documented this well, which I'm really sad about because it's one of my favorite pieces I've ever made. And I did it in a bunch of different galleries, and this was not the best one, but I have the best pictures from this one. But anyway, you can see that the projection is it makes the room very blue. The text looked kind of like this. And one of the ideas behind this piece, which is something that I've returned to a lot, is trying to provide scientific text in a way that is kind of experiential to read. So I was always interested in the parallel of like reading a book about quantum physics and imagining I was reading a novel or something. It's like, how do we know that this is true? We can't see it. It's kind of a story. I'm just experiencing and envisioning that story in my mind. Most people don't react to scientific texts that way. So I was trying to sort of do this in a way that that would sort of bring that experience to the audience. And then the sound piece, I'm not playing any of that at the moment. So anyway, I wanted to introduce that because when I got to Finland, this was actually halfway through my Fulbright. So this was January 2017. I made all of the work for this show in November and December of 2016, so immediately following the last election. And I was feeling very stressed. And I was on the other side of the world. I was actually at a residency in the center of Finland in the middle of nowhere in the forest when the election happened last time. And that was really strange. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what my relationship was to everything that was going on, being so far away, being in this place that felt like, you know, I don't know, it was unbelievably gorgeous. And I knew I was going to have this show in January. So I decided to do a show about the idea of light. And January is one of the darkest times in Helsinki and in Finland in general. In Helsinki, there's only like 6 hours of daylight a day in January. And so I thought it would be nice to do a show about light. And also all of the material I had at hand were images that I had shot in snowy forests. And so I was thinking about light and the color white from snow, light in a dark time, light at a dark time of year. And that was kind of where how the show came together. But I also wanted to take that piece that I just showed you and turn it into an exhibition somehow. So to have this relationship between text and image, which has become a really central part of my practice. And so what was kind of key about the setup for this show was that the gallery had this LED screen, which was meant for advertising, and it could loop for 24 hours a day. So it could face the street and it stayed on 24 hours a day. So I wrote a text about light and the color white and snow and reflectivity and climate. And that was like, the text is 14 minutes long, the video, and it loops, and it was on all the time. And so you could, and I'll show you a clip of that in a second, but so if you were on the street, you could read the text and the text might kind of contextualize what you're looking at through the window. But then when you get inside of the gallery, I'll show these first. When you go inside of the gallery, you don't see the text anymore. You see the video, you see this print on a table. And so the text, I'll play part of this. And there's a couple excerpts here. So I'll just pause it on there, and it goes on to kind of, talk about climate change a little bit in terms of ice melting. But there was something, obviously, a kind of photo joke here about white balance. But thinking about a kind of global concept of white balance, that, how the snow cover, depending on how much it is, how less it is, how that contributes to the warming of the planet, that felt like a type of white balance to me. And I liked thinking about that in relationship to all of the work, because it was, it's all photography based. So I'm going to show a clip from the other video while I talk. Let's see what I missed. Something that I was really wondering about when I made this show was, what are the relationships between quantum physics and climate change? I figured there must be. And I Googled that, and there was a very informative video that came up from Wired, like right away, kind of explaining to me how it worked. But it felt important to kind of tie everything together. But again, just to reiterate that having that text video kind of give you the potential context for the show, but not tell you how to view the show. That's something that's really important to me. And I think a lot about the relationships between text and image, what text can do on its own, what images can do on their own that text can't do, and what text and image can do together. And for a very long time, I was pretty resistant to using text kind of directly alongside my images, which is something that has changed, as we will see later on. And so this video, this section of the video, obviously, I made it in After Effects. It's a series of still images that are floating around. And then this is kind of a throwback to that first video that I showed you, but really trying to, but thinking a lot more just about perception and what we can see that moves and what we can't see that moves, and kind of suggesting that there's movement outside of what we're able to see. And to also kind of become aware of our own act of looking and our own perception. And a friend from Germany came up to Helsinki, and we did a sound performance together in the exhibition. So that kind of rounded out me turning that empty space piece into a show in terms of format, combining these three different types of information: the visual, the textual, and the sonic. Okay, I'm going to breeze through these for time, but I just want to show print work that I've done, mostly because it's less project-based in the way that the other stuff that I'm showing today is, but these prints really are a big part of my thinking. I think about them like making drawings, honestly, even though it's more of a collage process in Photoshop. But it helps me kind of work out the visual language that I'm working with, or that I'm kind of going to work with. And a lot of ideas come out in the process, and different prints kind of explore different ideas. This one's one of my favorites of all time. One of my good friends and I refer to this as the big green weirdo because it's just like a really bizarre piece. And some of them have more specific stories than others. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to get into them too much. But this one you can see is called Spectrums 1. So this was kind of maybe one of the first times I was really thinking about. In this case, I was thinking about a spectrum between water and land when you're on a coast. That a coast the coast itself doesn't really exist. It's kind of this meeting point between these two forms of material. And so, through this layering, could I get these two materials to kind of become each other almost? This pair was kind of a joke. It was my idea of a joke on monochromes. These are my landscape monochromes. So on the left, using scans of, again, rocks from Iceland, and then on the right, scans of a material called selenite that I pulled out of the Salt Lake in Utah. This was the show I did at Rawson Projects. This was another piece made from photos from the Salt Lake. And then I want to just quickly pause to run through two ideas and two quotes. So this one is from an essay or an article from Wired magazine, again, that came out several years ago whenever New Horizons got to Pluto. And I remember being really excited when this article came out because it was something I had been thinking about for a long time and never really seen anybody write about. And it's this middle paragraph. So she's talking about the spacecraft that's gone to Pluto. And so in the middle, she says, there is something between us and Pluto aside from the vastness of space. Two sensors called Lori and Ralph mounted on New Horizons are actually seeing Pluto, and what we're seeing are pictures. And whenever that's the case, we should be deeply philosophically skeptical about whether what we're seeing has the meaning we're imparting on it. And what was interesting about that to me is that I had for a long time been thinking about these spacecraft that we go send out to space to see for us, and how they never really get that much, how the mechanics of how those things see never really get that much attention. We're really obsessed with the photos that they bring back. But the idea that there is this in-between between us and the thing that we are seeing that's really far away, it took me a lot longer to kind of realize that what my camera was the same thing, was that kind of in-between between me and this thing that I was looking at. And it wasn't until I was in Finland in the middle of the snowy forests that I read a book by another amazing thinker named Karen Barad, who is a quantum physicist and a feminist scholar, who very articulately explains how the measuring tools that we use to measure things define the measurements that we are able to make with them. And so, for example, if you take a ruler, you can measure a flat thing that can be, and get its length in inches or centimeters. But if you try to take a ruler outside and go measure the wind, good luck. Like a ruler does not allow you to measure the wind. Like maybe you can see how far like a twig is moving because of the wind, but you can't measure the wind with a ruler. And that idea really sort of hit home with me as I was out there kind of looking at the snowy forest through my camera, being like, oh, right, my camera is this kind of measuring device that I'm using to see things with. And it as a kind of technology is both determining what images come back, it's determining what kinds of images can come back, and it's also kind of the tool through which I am looking at everything. And that became super important. And just to skip ahead to this piece, this was kind of the beginning of me really trying to embrace myself as the looker. And it's a subtle shift for most, I think, but for me, between like, say, that big green piece that we were looking at before and this one, things start to get a lot more loose here. And moving forward, they, in kind of my own small way, they start to loosen up a bit. I was thinking about making flags for the landscape and or ecological flags, whatever. There's a whole series of these fabric pieces. I'm going to move kind of quickly. And so again, these were really fun to make, and really necessary to make for me for a lot of reasons. And I think they culminated, these are some more big ones. They culminated in, and here's some installation views from this year, earlier this year. They culminated in this piece, which was sort of a commission for this biennial in Finland that happened last summer. And the curator had asked me, oh, can those fabric prints go outside? And I said, no, they'll get ruined, but let me figure out if I can make a fabric print that can live outside, which obviously I could. So with this one, what I wanted to do was combine images from different seasons, because I knew this piece was going to live outside from the middle of June until the middle of September in Finland, and it was going to get rained on and maybe snowed on and blown around in the wind and who knows what. So I thought it would be interesting to kind of reflect upon the idea that these landscapes completely transform between one season and another, and that's obviously true in many parts of the world. But I had never really thought about seasons as like a formal device before, but obviously if you show someone a picture of winter, they're going to feel one thing, and if you show them a picture of summer, they're going to feel another thing. And so I became interested in that over the course of all of this time, but really sort of combined the two different. There's a few images from the autumn in here as well. But here's a picture from several months later when stuff was really growing around it. And I think what made this piece so successful, almost compared to the other ones, was that it really allowed my point to be very clear, which is, now that you're looking at sort of the real thing next to my version of the real thing, it becomes very clear that you're seeing my version of the real thing, and that it's kind of about that translation that I am making visually through these digital images. Here's a close-up. And it was nice because, the fabric was it's a little bit sheer. So the wind could go through it, but it would move it, obviously, and shadows and changing light. And so getting to interact with the landscape behind it, I think, was really, really effective. Okay, so to talk about the most recent stuff, or some of the most recent stuff, actually. This is Kilpisjärvi, which is at the very tip of Finland, as you can see, right on the Swedish and Norwegian borders. And there's a residency up here that I did during my Fulbright. And then I returned to two summers, summer of 2018 and 2019. and adding to the now growing list of me doing funny things in really barren places. This is one of my new favorite pictures of me that was taken by my friend Tanya in Helsinki when we were out hiking last summer. And I should say that in 2018, I got a new camera, which was exciting because it sort of, I had started to understand, like, this is my tool now. And I decided to get a macro lens so that I could basically do what I'm doing here. And all of those most recent prints that you saw, some of them, there were a lot of really close-up images of plants, and those are all from here and from ground that looks like this. But the other main feature of this landscape is the lake, and Kilpis Järvi. Järvi means lake in Finnish, and so Kilpis is the lake there. And these mountains out in the background, that's actually Sweden. And here you can only see part of the lake, but this lake has become, well, this whole landscape, it's probably my favorite place that I've ever been, and I'm pretty obsessed with it. And I made a lot of work there. And I just finished the third of 3 video pieces based around this landscape, and I'm going to talk about 2 of them. So one feature of Kilpis Järvi, obviously because it's so far north, is that the sun doesn't set in the summer. And when I got up there in 2018, I was kind of like, wow, this is amazing. The sun doesn't set. I'd always heard about it, but never seen it. And I was trying to think about an interesting way to try to capture that. And it was, I got pretty obsessed with trying to figure out how to solve that problem of doing that in an interesting way without text, because there's really not a way to do it without sort of some linguistic item saying, like, you know, this is shot during an Arctic summer, or the sun's not setting, or midnight sun, or whatever. And so I started experimenting with different ideas. And the first thing that I did in 2018 was that every night around 1 in the morning or 12:45 a.m., I would go, the house that I stay in is right on the lake, in one part of the lake. And I would go out every night. I was up there for like 2 weeks, I think. And I went out every night and took photos of the lake at that one time. And then I started playing with using these different images of the lake at the same time from different days in relationship to each other. And the idea was that, well, the lake is a reflection of the light, wind, and weather conditions. And so it became kind of this mirror surface that was kind of the perfect combination of everything, because it's moving, so I could make video of it. It's always changing. It's sort of tantalizing to look at, but it also becomes a record of what is going on and what is changing around it. And so by using these different elements in relation, or these different sort of images in relationship to each other, I mean, for this piece, I think, you know, with the title very clearly states what is going on. And I kind of hate that, even though it's a very effective like way of working, is sort of making a very conceptual piece and titling it to kind of gear your viewers in the right direction. To me, on some level, it sometimes feels like a cop-out, but that's like a personal thing. I'm pretty obsessed with the idea of trying to figure out, if an artwork has to communicate something to you, how can that communication be in the work? How can that information be in the work somehow, rather than being like a title or being a wall text? And so that puzzle has been something I've been kind of trying to figure out for a bunch of years. And it all came to a head with this work about the light and the lake. And so I made one video that I'm not going to talk about. That was kind of a transitional exploratory piece. It's a weird one, but it uses footage from 9 consecutive nights of footage I took of the lake around the same time, along with a bunch of other stuff and with text. But the piece that I am going to talk about, there's two that I'm going to talk about, but this one I shot in 2019 when I went back. I realized I had never stayed awake for 24 hours, which made no sense to me, having had been there before for a few weeks. And so I decided to try to stay awake for 24 hours and shoot video of the lake and its surroundings every hour for those 24 hours and then make a piece out of it. And then I was hoping that, you know, by seeing in full succession this same kind of shot, or similar, it's not the same shot, but you'll see, I'll show you a clip, but it's very similar sets of shots transitioning, that you would know that time is passing. And you may not know that it's 24 hours. You may not know that this is starting at 1 in the morning. And at the end of the video, there is a screen that says exactly what the title says here, but you have to get to the end of the video to watch it. But the other thing that kind of happened between the previous video and this video is that these digital marks that I was making that were kind of drawing marks or painterly marks, I kind of stopped making them and I turned them into masks. And so for all of you Photoshop people, you know what masks are. I love masks because they kind of allow me to draw with my images. But the other thing that I think is really, that I'm really excited about this mode of working for me, is that these masks kind of become both a lens through which we're looking at the landscape, they become a tool through which we're looking at it, and they become the hand through which we're looking at it. And so it's like, as if I wasn't present enough in the work before, I think here it's sort of similar, but it's a lot more clear. It's very direct. It's like you are seeing this place through something. And you don't even have to really, you don't even have to put that together. It's just, that's just what's happening. Oh, so here's the final screen from the video. And here's I think this is like 3 minutes, this clip. And what I should say also is that I had the idea to ask 4 different sound artist friends to make soundtracks for this piece. And they're working on them. And I thought that was interesting because I hadn't used sound in video for like 10 years. Decided that it made sense for this for a variety of reasons, which we can talk about later if people are curious. But what's interesting is that to have 4 different versions of the soundtrack it allows that sound artist to respond to my response to this place. And then we can kind of experience 4 different versions of that. So with these shots, they're like pretty simultaneous, or no, they're not simultaneous, but the video that is sort of revealed through the masks is happening like at a very similar time to what's kind of the main shot. And there's a couple of different masks that recur over the course of the video. So like this one shows up again later on. And there's another, the one you'll see next kind of recurs later on as well. So it kind of gives you the idea that these are stable, fairly stable kind of tools for, or lenses through which we are looking at this place, even though the place keeps changing. And it took a while to figure out how to structure this. And I was lucky because around 3 in the morning, I remember I was sitting inside looking out the window and this fog starts to roll in over the lake. And I was like, oh my God. And I went outside and, you know, normally I had been shooting just like short 1 to 2 minute shots. But when this started to happen, I filmed for like 15 minutes straight while this fog rolled in and just completely changed color over the course of 15 minutes. And so there's two, this shot and the next one. Kind of show the beginning of it. And so there's no color correction or like adjustment in this at all. And over the course of a couple hours, or maybe even less than that, I can't remember, it faded completely to white. And by 7 in the morning, if you watch the video for a few more minutes, by 7 in the morning, it's just completely white. And then all of a sudden, 8 in the morning, the sun is back out and you can see everything again. And I got so lucky that this happened the night that I was shooting, because it makes this video, it has this like dramatic midpoint where the beginning at 1 in the morning is very nice because the light is pretty, like, which is from like, oops, sorry, this photo, this is 1 in the morning. You know, the day after the fog happened, it was actually really boring because it was just sunny. So having this dramatic video sort of interlude in the fog interlude in the middle is really important. Okay, I just realized I forgot to share my sound for this one. So let me, let's see if I can do this. I have to stop this and do it again and share the sound. And then, okay, so this piece is my magnum opus ode to Kilpis Järvi, and I made it this summer. And it is the piece that I never wanted to make because it's a video with voiceover text. And I have been avoiding that video for this entire time. And finally, I caved in for a variety of reasons. And I'm really happy I did, because I now have learned a lesson to myself, which is that rather than saying this is a format that I don't like, so I'm going to avoid it, it would be better to say this is a format I don't like, so I'm going to try to figure out how to make it work for myself, which is what happened here. And basically, you know, you can see from the last piece to this one that these images are, on one hand, at least kind of in terms of the amount of pieces and parts they have, they're a lot simpler than what I was doing, you know, a couple years earlier, or even a year earlier, or 2 years earlier. And I think I don't know, there's a lot to talk about in terms of attention and detail and ecology and landscape and all that kind of stuff with this, but I really wanted to just simplify it for a minute and try to look at what we were actually looking at. And so with this piece, I'm going to play like 5 minutes from it, I think, because it's kind of hard to get a sense of it otherwise. And so maybe I'll just do that, and then I can talk about it a little bit more afterwards. So this is a 35-minute piece, and I shot it in 2019. And oh yeah, and it's up in this show right now in Helsinki, which we can also talk about later. But I decided to show it as a projection with these 2 posters. And the text is from the video. But I like, the video is kind of a conflation of observational language, poetic language, scientific, numerical language. And so putting this together made sense. So anyway, here's the video. Melting snow makes mountain streams.
Tiers of snow, shelves of snow, wind from another direction, warmer wind, damp ground, planetary landscape. The wavelengths of visible light range from 0.4 to 0.7 micrometers. Air moves from regions of high pressure to regions of low pressure. On Earth, wind is the bulk movement of air. In the universe, wind is defined as the flow of gases on a large scale. Aspects of wind: velocity, density, energy, direction. Global winds of all speeds are caused by air moving from areas of higher pressure to areas of lower pressure. The strongest winds on Earth are in the mid-latitudes, where cold polar air meets warm tropical air. Solar winds are made up of charged particles called plasma, which have escaped the sun's atmosphere. Theoretical winds, hydrodynamic winds. Stellar winds may cause stars to lose mass over time. The luminous winds of hot, massive stars. The gas pressure gradient-driven winds of cool stars. Planetary winds cause light chemical elements, such as hydrogen, to escape a planet's atmosphere. Over time, water-rich planets like Earth can become barren, like Venus. On Venus, winds at speeds of 300 kilometers per hour or 190 miles per hour circle the planet high up in the clouds every 4 to 5 Earth days. When sunlight hits the poles of Mars after winter, frozen carbon dioxide turns immediately to gas, creating winds up to 400 kilometers per hour or 250 miles per hour. These winds move large amounts of dust and water vapor across the terrain. The fastest winds recorded on a known planet, HD 8060b, which sits 190 light years from Earth, reach speeds of more than 4 kilometers per second or 11,000 miles per hour. Wind or lack of wind? Wind or no wind? Today there was no wind. Today the air is still. The temperature dropped, and a fog came over the hills and didn't let up until sometime overnight. I am looking at things again and again. Same hills, different patches of snow. More snow than when I left last year, in early summer. A state of a place, that state of this place, gets stuck in the mind as an image. Now this state, this evolving place, layers back to form a new one, this year's image. With repeated visits and repeated viewings, a multi-tiered image, a layered place.
So that's that's the first 5 minutes of the video, and it goes on to talk about a lot of different things. But the kind of setup that you got there about scientific facts about wind, wind on Earth, wind in the solar system, wind in the universe, weather on other planets, direct kind of observation and thought that I have in the landscape, all of that gets kind of conflated over the course of the video. And sometimes you see text with image, sometimes you have text alone, and sometimes you have image alone. And I could spend the whole hour talking about this piece itself, but just a couple of points about it is that one, I really have been thinking about how when we read something or when we hear words, we make an image of it in our minds. And when we look at an image, you look at an image and the image goes into your mind. And so how does that image, are those images different from each other or are they the same in terms of what it ends up as once it's in your head? So that was something that I was kind of playing with here of like, having the image alone, having the text creating an image, and then sometimes having them work together to kind of complicate that image. And the other thing about this piece, and I didn't say this before, but when I was in Svalbard 8 years ago, something that really struck me was this feeling that I was standing on a planet, which is like, a little cheesy, but it was true. It was the first time I had ever really felt that. I grew up in the city, and all of a sudden I was in this place where the scale was like something I had absolutely never experienced in my life. And, realizing like all these planetary processes are happening around me, and I'm just standing here and I'm very small. And my, that kind of sense of a scale shift has stuck with me since then. And is one reason I really like to return to these places where you can kind of feel all of these processes at work. And so the kind of what the text in this video does, it never actually states we are in Kilpisjärvi in Finland. You don't know that except if you just know that. There's allusions to the sun not setting, and there's like different allusions to kind of characteristics of the place itself, but there's a lot of contrasting it to, there's a point where we talk about the strongest wind ever measured in the universe is from the accretion disk of some black hole named blah, 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 like a bunch of numbers, or like I talk about Titan, one of Saturn's moons a lot, and how Titan is one of the only places in the solar system besides Earth where there can be rainbows. And so kind of trying to take this place and talk about it very specifically as the place that it is, but also kind of contextualize it and turn it into something that is planetary. And the video ends on a note of, saying like, I am standing on this planet, in this space between two hills, whatever. And I think that was really important to me as a way to both combine the scientific language in an experiential way, going back to that earlier piece, with me as the observer, kind of taking everything in and looking at it and giving it to you as the viewer, with this sort of landscape in front of me, trying to, and the scientific data, kind of allowing all of that to coexist is what has made this piece kind of, I don't know, it was surprising to me in what it became, and it's like an exciting direction for me to go. So I'm hitting time, but I just want to really, really briefly, just for something like surprising to everybody, including me, is what I'm working on right now. And I was really lucky to get invited to go on like a fellowship residency to the opposite end of the world, to where I had been all of these other times or all these years, which was a biodiversity research station in old growth Amazon, remote Ecuador. And I went about a year ago. And there's the last picture of me doing a dumb thing in a in a overgrown, crazy looking place. But it took me like 9 months to figure out how to even start to engage with this material, because I was like, on one level, this place is the opposite of the places that I have been working for the past like 8 years. And so how can I possibly treat it the same way? But then at the same time, I'm the same person, and the way that I work and the way that I think about things is still me. So how do I kind of start to figure that out? And it took me a long time, both to feel like I could even approach these images that I had taken of this place, because it felt, there's a lot to talk about in terms of, environmental, ecological issues with these fragile, environments that I keep ending up in. But yeah, just saying, like, I was only here for like a week. It's like, how could I even do anything out of that? And so it was a long process that finally this spring and summer, I really got into it. And the one kind of, the requirement from this residency fellowship that I did, that is started by a friend of mine, is to make an artist book. And so he's having everyone who goes make a book that's the same format. And mine's in progress. It's going to be called Rain Forest, I think. And I just wanted to show a couple images from it, just as a closing thought, because they're taking some stuff that I learned from the video that I just showed, and then trying to sort of really change up other stuff while also kind of continue to do what it is that I do. And so my prediction is that what I'm learning from making all of these images for this book is going to result in a video at some point next year, which I'm excited about. But there's a couple different threads, and this is one of them. And it's kind of, which are just these, again, using masks to make these drawings, but the drawings are kind of a direct response to the shapes of the plants that are in the images. And with these, it's kind of the idea, my thinking with these is that there's so much to look at in this tiny isolated bit that I've given you, that you can only imagine what's outside of this. And that also, something that I really was thinking about when I was there was how dense everything is and how impossible it is to look at one thing. And so these were kind of my attempts to go to my images and look at things kind of one at a time. And the other thing that I decided to try to do was, can I make text that I wrote while I was there part of my images? And that goes back to what I was saying before of wanting to have this information like in the image rather than as a caption to the image. But then also thinking that a place like the Amazon, where of course there's a lot that you can see, but these images don't show you how hot it was, how humid it was, how loud it was, how like kind of, I don't know, how overwhelmed. I think that's something that's really interested me with all of this work, is just the limits of what a camera is able to communicate. And so, going to a place like this and knowing that people are going to say, oh, I can't wait to see what it was like. And then for me, it's like, I can't tell you what it was like. It's not possible for me to communicate this to you. And so what I'm going to give you is a completely restricted view of what it was like, kind of, so that you don't have any doubt in your mind that you were looking at it through me. And there's a lot of issues that all of this work kind of brings up for me, which is, just issues of representation, it's issues of documentation, of like objective documentation, sort of interpretation, trust in science, like, which of course I do trust in science, but there's like a whole wide range of things that I'm kind of trying to play with and think about. But on a very basic level, it's like, how can I try to communicate this thing that I have seen to you that have not seen it? And I'm doing that through this technology, and through my camera and through this software and through these screens, and knowing that I have all of those limitations on it, like what can I give you to make you experience it in some way, or like feel it in some way. So that's a closing note, I guess. And there's a lot of these. There's more that I have not like edited this down yet or anything, but eventually it'll be a book, and it's also going to be a series of prints. But I was really having fun making these over the summer, and discovering this new font to use that's very different from, as you've noticed, the font that I basically used forever before this, and playing with language, and that's it. So I'm totally happy for questions or anything if people have them.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Leah. The new work is fantastic. I can't wait to see this book as it comes to its end. I can definitely see this like evolution in the way you treat the images, but still like all of your own hand in there. Anyways, we have a lot of students in here, we have a lot of visitors in here, and we have a little bit of time. So if we want to take 2, 3, 4 questions, that would be great. Go ahead, and if you got a microphone and you want to just jump in and blurt them out, go for it. And I will keep an eye on the chat, and I can read some of those out if we have any silent moments. So feel free.
I know Zoom is a vacuum, but someone can definitely shout something out if you have a question.
Hey, Leah.
Hey.
Thank you for that. That was great. I've been following your work for like decades at this point. I sort of work in a very similar fashion where I travel a lot for my work, and I'll like go and capture. So it was like great to hear you talk about how you use photography as a material. So it's like you go as a resource, like a research trip, and you gather and gather and gather, and then you come back, and that's what you make work from. My question is, what do you do when you have ideas that you don't have materials from? Like,
yeah.
You only have so much time.
Yeah, that's a good question. And yeah, there's definitely stuff that doesn't happen. But actually, maybe that's not totally true, because it doesn't happen in the moment. But I think those ideas that really matter just sort of sit there, and then at some point when I do have whatever it is, then they come out later in ways that I often wouldn't expect them to. But I think that I think about, with my work, I think about I think about it as being very responsive. And it's funny actually, because a joke that I forgot to make was that, the kind of, I don't know, almost all of the time since I went to Svalbard has been me going to the north to try to find ice again, and like not being able to get there because it's really hard to get to ice on your own, and having to kind of work with what I was able to get instead of what I might have been like, it's like going to a glacier is hard and expensive. And so where can I go where, I can walk around alone and sort of do my thing and like stare at the ground through my camera, and so it's funny because at the beginning of all of this, like I wasn't interested in plants at all, but it's like, it's kind of here's kind of a goal. And if I can't hit that goal, then what do I have here that's what's here that's interesting to me, and then how can I work with it, and kind of stretching my own boundaries of interest as I go to say, well, this didn't used to fit into the logic, but maybe now it does, even though I didn't think it would. So yeah, and also, you know, over time, also thinking like what all of this work has really taught me. I mean, it's taught me a lot about my own work and what it is that I'm doing. And it's also taught me about, like, you know, how I look at things and what kinds of things I seek out. And, you know, like I just moved in the spring from New York to Rhode Island. And, you know, now I can go around to places here and take pictures. And that's not something I've ever done before in terms of making work. And so it's like, maybe I had to go to the other ends of the planet in order to, which is sort of dumb on some level, but also cool, you know, to like learn how to look at what's right in front of me, maybe. But also I don't think that's a problem either. So it's kind of it's like a gradual gathering, expanding, putting something on hold, coming back to it later, that kind of thing.
That's great. Thank you so much for that answer. Really, really good for us here too. We live in one of the most seemingly empty places on the planet until you learn how to look at it differently. And like you said earlier, realize how full and chaotic it is. We have time for a few more questions. So again, type it in the chat or just go ahead and jump in anytime.
I had a question about some of the like sound pieces. I was going through your website and saw like your most recent post with the ice.
Mm-hmm.
And I was particularly like intrigued and very like interested in like the story behind it, because and like what I was really listening to, because it was like I could tell it was ice, yes, but like the way it had been manipulated was like, I don't know, kind of surreal and serene.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up sound, because it's something that I used to work with a lot, and I haven't for a while, but periodically something will come up, and it's like that piece. And it's something that I've been kind of, for several years, I've been sitting on it and thinking, actually, this is a good example of something I just haven't had time for or haven't made time for. But I think it has a place in context of my work. In one sense, because I think about sound recording similar to thinking about photography, that it's just like one way of capturing one dimension of a space that becomes abstracted when you decontextualize it from that space. But yeah, that piece, I don't think anything, I'm trying to remember, I don't think anything of it was manipulated per se, but it's definitely layered. And I think I was invited to make it by a Japanese sound artist that I have been in contact with for several years, who does a lot of work around ice. And he put together a show at a space in Tokyo like last year. That was a surround sound show of different artists' sound pieces made from recordings of ice. And so I had made recordings of ice mostly in Svalbard, but I think a little bit maybe elsewhere, but I think it was mostly from there. No, it was totally from there, actually. And I think I was combining recordings that were made with like a shotgun microphone, like in the air, and hydrophone recordings that were underwater. So they just get two different dimensions of the same thing, or two different kind of performances of the same thing, maybe. And I think that's been, one of my, I guess I treat my sound pieces very similar to how I treat these digital images or these images that I make, where they're kind of collaged and layered, and you have different things operating kind of in tandem. but nothing is ever really manipulated. They're just kind of layered and contrasted to one another. So that's pretty much what was going on in that piece.
Oh, that makes sense. Makes sense.
Yeah, thanks for asking about that.
Yeah, no problem. It was really cool because I could like definitely like tell like that some of it was recorded underwater and that some of it was recorded like above like where the ice was at. So it's cool to know like how that was made.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and yeah, I did a lot of sound work in grad school with a sound artist named Stephen Vitello, who's a wonderful sound artist if you don't know his work. And he always, yeah, when I was getting ready to, and actually Ed, who I saw here at this talk, Ed also gave me a lot of tips on what stuff to bring up to the Arctic in terms of, yeah, I think like the two of them really helped me figure out what equipment to use to record stuff up there. But yeah, the same idea that I talked about, that like, you know, different measuring tools can measure different things. It's like different, you know, Stephen let me borrow this very low frequency recorder that theoretically lets you listen to the atmosphere, but you can only do it when you're really, really far away from any signal. And it was funny because I brought it up to Svalbard and I was like, you know, up on the top of some hill trying to record like the atmosphere or whatever. And then the generator from the boat was interfering with my recording. And so it was just like, you know, it's just this thing where like you're trying to get away from everything and you just can't because you're here. But yeah, just kind of knowing that that these different tools allow you to capture things in different ways is super interesting, and how it translates from scientific measurement all the way to like what microphones we use to record something.
Thanks for that, Thomas. That was a really good question. Does anybody else have one to jump in? I have a few of my own, and we're also out of time, so we can go either way. I don't mind going over a few minutes. Those of you who are students that have places to go, feel free to log out, and maybe we'll hang out for another 3 or 4 minutes. Can I ask you a question, another question about equipment? This I kind of like thought about this. I found it really interesting to hear you say, like, so many photographers and artists will kind of talk about their tools as transparent. Like I choose photography when it's the perfect tool for the job, and if it wasn't the right tool for the job, then I would choose something else, you know. So sort of like avoiding this interaction with photography, like it's just this like tool on the side and I make it see-through and things like that, which doesn't seem to be the case. I feel like in your work that the tool, the recording devices become like dense, like you can't see through them, or you're being asked to see through them. So I wonder, when you pick up these new tools, sorry, my phone started ringing. When you pick up these new tools, do you choose the tool to record something specific, or do you decide what to record, like what to point it at due to the choice of the tool? Like, does the tool guide your looking, or does your looking guide the choice of the tool?
I think it's kind of, I think it flips back and forth between the two, maybe. And I think, well, what it makes me think of first was that actually when I was in the Amazon, my friend Max, who invited me down there, we were walking around, and he's a sculptor, and he was picking up everything that was on the ground and like touching everything. And I was like, oh, cool, let me take a photo of that. And he was like, oh, you're such a photographer and I'm a sculptor because I just want to touch everything and you just want to take pictures of everything. And it's kind of like, I've always been really interested in images, and I've always defined myself as an image maker on some level or another. And I'm not really interested in sculpting, say, or 3D, even digital 3D. And so in that sense, I guess I've always thought about, there's images that I can make, and then there's images that I can like take or acquire. And I used to, I mean, I spent grad school drawing for the most part, and then I moved into using found space images and scientific images. And I think that photography, once I figured it out, I realized that conceptually it was kind of similar to those scientific graphs I showed at the beginning, because it's theoretically representing information that some people can see informatively in certain ways and other people can't. And once I realized that it was sort of allowed me to bring my own observations of something or combine my own observations of something with that kind of question of index that's so central to photography, but then that I could sort of twist it and make you aware that you're looking at my looking at it, it kind of became the perfect tool. And you know, maybe now that I've spent so many years doing that, it allows me to understand what I was doing with sound in a different way that I maybe didn't before, that is kind of the same thing with a different tool. But so in that sense, you know, when I went to get my new camera, I mean, I just have like a Sony A7R3 or whatever that everybody has. And I picked it because it was, I liked the mirrorless cameras because I travel so much and they're not heavy. And then it was like, okay, well, what lens am I going to get? Because this is like the defining feature of what my work is going to look like for the next, like, however long I have this camera. And I decided to go macro because, you know, rather than a zoom lens, which theoretically would allow me to see something in a way that I couldn't see it, a macro lens can only give me what I can see. And even though it can sort of magnify maybe what I can see, you know, at the far end, it wasn't like drastically different from my own like bodily experience as a wide angle lens or as a zoom lens or something like that. So I decided to go with a macro because it was sort of the most direct translation of what my own looking experience was, and realizing that I was documenting my looking experience. And so that became important.
Thank you. Yeah, that's perfect. It's very interesting how like the choice of something like that doesn't just affect the images you're making, but it like has created like a, you know, produced a physical space around you that's like your moving studio. You have to get closer to the ground. Cool. Anybody else out there in the Zoom or the chat want to ask one more question before we are out of time?
Yeah, I want to ask one.
Hey, Ed.
Aaron, thanks for having me. Hi, Leah. I'll try and keep this very brief, but you talked about basically a myriad of issues dealing with having these kind of overwhelming geographically tied experiences and then trying to convey some sense of them through a kind of subset of what seems to be very narrow tools. And I can relate. And I'm just wondering if in that process, like where are the points that you start to feel comfortable about the material that you have, the artifacts that are left over from your travels, and the point where you start to feel confident enough in them and then in your own abilities to work with them, and if that relates to basically like some sort of distance or the amount of time from the initial travel experience, if that's, you just have to let some time go by before the rest of the process can start.
There we go. Sorry, I don't know how that happened. So yes, really good question. And I think, I mean, Kilpisjärvi kind of screwed everything up because I've spent so much time there. Since I've been there 3 times, I think I've spent a total of like almost 8 weeks there. And because it's such a kind of contained location, I've been able to get to know, and I know you've been there, so you know what I'm talking about, the surroundings like very well. And I think that that was super valuable because being there for so long, looking at things over and over again and feeling like I sort of had some kind of validated understanding of it gave me a kind of liberty to start to mess around in different ways with something that maybe I otherwise would have felt was kind of like reverential on some level. And I think that the repeated visits there allowed me to both project a lot of different stuff onto it and think through it in a lot of different ways. And to feel like, because I think that something that's come up a lot for me is, you know, who am I as this outsider foreigner to just show up somewhere and then like document this place that's not mine and just turn it into something that is mine. And, you know, I think one reason why I've tried to make it like with the new video from Kilpisjärvi with all of the kind of scientific language, what excites me about that piece is that it's taking the specific place and making it something larger than itself, rather than saying, here is what I think this place is. And so it makes it less about like me pinning it down and rather me sort of trying to say like, I will show it to you in relation to all of the things that it makes me think about, maybe. And so that, yeah, that felt like maybe one of the most kind of honest or successful sort of translations, I guess. But then when I went to the Amazon last year and I only had 7 days, after having spent 3 weeks in Kilpisjärvi for like the 3rd time, I was just like, how am I supposed to do anything? And this, you know, culturally, I know nothing. I've never been to South America before. Like I'd spent like 3 years in Finland basically. So I felt like I had some kind of context for something. And that was one reason why it took me like 9 months to even come anywhere near those images, because it just didn't, I felt like who was I to even start? But then I realized at the same time, that is true, but not that many people get to go to these places. And I feel a kind of ethical responsibility to try to bring them to people who can't go to them. And how can I do that in a way that respects the place, that respects the limitations that I see in what photography can do, and that tries to kind of bring together things about that place that are important. And it's hard. So sometimes I mean, that was a year ago and I'm still working on this. So I think it really depends, but oftentimes I'll sit on material for a long time before I feel ready to know what to do with it. If that answers the question. Cool.
Thanks, Ed. That was a great question and a great answer, Leah.
Thanks.
With that, I think we should probably wrap it up. We're 10 minutes over time.
Yeah, my apologies.
Leah has done her part for what we paid her. So thank you so much for joining us, Leah. It was such a great talk. And if you want to send any links or anything else to share with the students here at TTU My Way, I will share that stuff all with them as we go.
Sure.
And same thing with the students. If you have any unanswered questions or anything for Laura, sorry, I just looked at who's typing into the chat. For Leah, send them my way, and I can get you connected or something like that.
Yeah, for sure. I'm always happy to answer questions if people have. So awesome. Thank you so much for inviting me, Aaron, and everyone go vote.
Yeah. Thanks again. Go hit the polls. You've got however many hours left. We can still do this. So
that's right.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Awesome.
Have a nice
Thank
day.
you.
Bye, Leah.
Bye.